In 2018, a little-known republic in the middle of Central Asia came up with what seemed like a great plan to stop the mass exodus of skilled and educated workers, which is a problem that many developing countries around the world face. Its answer was simple. It stopped letting people leave the country, turning it into a prison twice the size of the UK. Turkmenistan even markets itself as a country that finds practical solutions to problems. That same year, President Berdim Hamadov banned the import of black cars because he thought they brought bad luck. Soon, people all over the country woke up to find that the police had taken away their cars overnight. Owners had to pay a lot of money to paint them again and get them back. Soon, this strange law was expanded to cover all colored cars as well. So if you look at satellite pictures of Turkmenistan, all you'll see are white cars, since that was the past president's favorite color. But Berdim Muhammadov's strange habits were nothing compared to those of Niazov, who called himself His Excellency, the great leader of the Turkmen and God's prophet on earth. Niazov built a huge 37-kilometer staircase into the Kopet Dag mountain range as a big show of care for his country's health. He made officials climb it every year as part of a so-called health walk, and he watched from a helicopter. At the finish line, he scolded them for going too slowly. Turkmenistan's leaders seemed to be able to make an endless number of confusing decisions. Names of the days of the week, months of the year, horse types, and even craters on the moon have been changed to suit the needs of the leader in power at the time. Niazov changed the name of bread to include his mother at one time. In a different strange event, he told people to chew on bones to improve their dental health, saying that dogs weren't allowed in dentist offices as an excuse. But dogs are hard to find in the city, because they're banned, because they have an unappealing odor. Every day for the past 30 years, people have been working hard to make the capital look like the perfect paradise of a tyrant. This ban is just one example of their efforts. Stunning skyscrapers, monuments, parks, stadiums, and mansions have been built on the rubble of whole neighborhoods. Each is made of perfect Italian marble and then lined with gold. A Guinness World Record was set for the city's use of so much marble. The city also has the largest indoor pool, the largest indoor Ferris wheel, the largest architectural star, and the most fountain pools in a public space, which is ironic since the country has a serious water shortage. Aside from the beautiful marble city and the sometimes funny behavior of its leaders, Turkmenistan's people who have to live there don't find much to laugh about. In August 2023, something sad happened in the huge cotton fields of Turkmenistan's Libap province. Tens of thousands of people worked hard by hand to gather their yearly cotton harvest, even though it was over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Even though seeing hardworking people in cotton fields isn't odd in and of itself, this group of workers was anything but normal. Instead of occasional farm workers, this huge sea of workers included teachers, doctors, lawyers, flight attendants, state workers, and even school children, none of whom chose to be there or were paid to be there. Because of a presidential order, half of the staff at both state and private businesses had to pick cotton during the week, and they had to do it all on the weekends. The country is now one of the few remaining totalitarian dictatorships in the world. Torture and psychoactive drugs are used by secret police against people who are against the government. People who are considered enemies of the state are put on live TV, forced to confess, and made to beg for forgiveness so that their families don't have to go through the same things. After that, they're gone, without a trace. Any kind of criticism of the government is seen as treasonous and often leads to long jail terms, confinement in psychiatric hospitals, or exile to the empty salt flats by the Caspian Sea. Turkmenistan was named as the second worst country in the world for freedom last year, even lower than Afghanistan, which is run by the Taliban, Eritrea, which is in the middle of a war, and the notorious North Korea. But with the passing of power from Berdim Muhammadov to his son in 2022, Central Asia's first direct succession since the time of the Khans, there isn't much hope that things will get better soon. Because of this, it's not a surprise that many people want to leave for a better life somewhere else, if the government doesn't stop them first. What made Turkmenistan such a horrible place to live? What gives its leaders such complete control over the country? Where does the seemingly endless money that keeps the regime going come from? This is the story of Turkmenistan, which has the weirdest government in the world. On September 9, 1879, Russian troops began a heavy shelling of Göktepe, a city that was surrounded by a strong mud wall 18 feet thick and 10 feet high that protected 40,000 Turkmen. Even though the Russians had better technology, their frontal attack on the city cost them a lot of lives because they were short on supplies and troops. They had to strategically withdraw to their base on the Caspian Sea. Russia had been slowly taking over more of Central Asia to protect its southern border, advance its economic interests, and raise its status around the world. It was Russia's first major setback in 164 years in its attempts to become an empire when it lost badly at Göktepe. The site of Göktepe was in what is now Turkmenistan, which is on the southern edge of Central Asia. People who lived in the area were mostly nomadic groups that walked the huge Karakum Desert and lived off of herding animals and stealing from trade caravans. Even though life was hard for these tribes, they were known for their fierce resistance to outside powers and their involvement in the slave trade. Some Russians who came to invade saw this brutal reality directly. Russia started a more planned second attack 2 years after their first defeat because they knew Göktepe was strategically important for taking over the rest of the area. They blew up a tunnel under the city wall on January 12, 1881 that was full of thousands of kilos of explosives. This made a hole in the city's defenses 140 feet wide, which let Russian troops flood in. After the city's people were brutally killed, the Tsar quickly took over the rest of Central Asia. Over the next 40 years, Russia didn't do much to integrate the area or its people into the state. Even though railroads grew and new towns like Ashgabat sprung up because of Russian immigrants, the area's mostly desert landscape, which makes up 90% of its land, stopped any real progress. On the eve of World War I, there were still only a few cotton gins, leather processing plants, and one plant that made steam engines in the industry sector. By 1916, the war was getting worse for Tsar Nicholas II, so he made the difficult choice to force Turkestani Muslims, who had not been required to serve in the military before, to join. This choice, along with a corrupt and cruel local government, led to widespread revolts all over Central Asia. The Russian Revolution the following year made things even worse. For 8 years, the area was in a lot of trouble, with war, revolution, famine, and destructive changes to the law. In the end, the Soviet Union rose from the ashes of the Russian Empire, and it took Central Asia by force as it became a socialist country. By 1924, most of the rebellion had been put down, and Central Asia was reorganized into separate ethnic and national political units. The Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic was officially set up as one of these. As part of major changes happening all over the Union, the government took back all the land and forced the nomads to live on state-run and community farms. At the same time, the government set up many schools and printing houses to standardize the Turkmen written language. To make Turkmenistan a Soviet country that would follow orders, many important programs were put in place to help people learn to read and write, stop fighting between tribes, and teach people Soviet values. As part of this change, political opposition was violently put down, leaving the Soviet sphere with a submissive and alone society. Even so, important events had an effect on Turkmenistan's changing personality. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union moved many of its businesses to safer areas. For example, Azerbaijan sent oil processing plants to Turkmenistan, and southern Russia sent a metal processing plant and about 20 textile plants. But compared to other countries, these changes were not as big because the infrastructure and energy sector were not as well developed. After the war, Turkmenistan didn't become fully industrialized because of the Soviet Union's policy of regionalization. This policy gave each republic a specific economic role based on its resources and skills to improve the Soviet Union's overall economic performance. Each republic became economically dependent on the others because of the strategy, which strengthened centralized control. Turkmenistan's harsh environment made it bad for many types of business, but it was perfect for growing cotton, which the Soviets wanted to be able to produce themselves. This goal seemed impossible to reach until the Karakum Canal, which is one of the biggest rivers in history, was built. It let water from the Amu Darya River flow through it and was completed in 1967. This tripled Turkmenistan's farmland and cotton production. Due to the huge cotton harvests, children and slaves were forced to work in the fields, skipping a lot of school to do so. But 97% of the cotton was sent to Russia to be processed, so Turkmenistan didn't get any of the perks or jobs that came with processing the cotton. When Turkmenistan's huge natural gas reserves were found and used, a similar pattern appeared. In the 1930s, they were first found, and in the 1960s, they were proven to be some of the world's largest oil pools. By the mid-1980s, Turkmenistan was second only to Russia in gas production. However, all this gas was sent to Russia to be processed. Turkmenistan got a bit for its gas, but a lot less than what it was worth on the global market. This took away the republic's natural wealth, which helped the other republics. So by the late 1980s, Turkmenistan's average per capita income was only 70% of the Soviet average, and most of the people there lived below the poverty line. Even though everyone in the republic learned to read and write and other social problems were fixed, life expectancy was still low, and the republic had the highest child mortality rate in the Union. Turkmenistan's first secretary was fired because leaders liked to lie about the numbers for political reasons. Sapar Murat Niyazow took his place during a crackdown on corruption in 1985. Niyazow was born in 1940 and lost his parents in a war and a terrible earthquake. He worked his way up in the Communist Party and eventually became first secretary of Turkmenistan. The Turkmen Communist Party became one of the most strict and conservative groups in the Soviet Union because of him. When other countries had economic stagnation and social unrest, Niyazow put down any opposition with brutal force. Turkmenistan's people tend to live in rural or agricultural areas and are deeply conservative, which has led to an attitude of obeying authority. Since the country had never been independent before it joined the Russian Empire, there weren't many nationalistic feelings to drive opposition. People and politicians were even more united in their support for keeping the Union together because they were afraid the economy would fall apart. As the Soviet Union began to fall apart in the early 1990s, Turkmenistan stayed mostly separate from the political and economic changes that other countries were going through. Even though they didn't want to, Turkmenistan claimed independence on October 27, 1991. Niyazow won the first presidential election on the same day with 98.3% of the vote, beating out all the other candidates. The Democratic Party of Turkmenistan took the name of the Communist Party of Turkmenistan, but not much else changed. Niyazow kept the control systems from the Soviet era in place as president of the newly independent country, while other former Soviet republics welcomed reforms. The government still had full control over the economy, including prices, wages, exchange rates, and trade between countries. Niyazow told Turkmenistan to accept a new constitution in 1992. The constitution was supposed to set up a presidential republic with checks and balances and protect religious speech and property rights. But in reality, it made Niyazow even more powerful over Turkmen society. He turned the media into the official voice of the Turkmenbashi, which is his own name and means great leader of the Turkmen. Because of this, he gained a lot of followers, and towns, landmarks, and pieces of infrastructure were renamed after him. When people compared Niyazow to Stalin, he denied it and said that his success was gained without using harsh methods. But other parties were banned, political opponents were killed by the secret police, and information sources from outside the country were highly censored, cutting people off from the rest of the world. This increase in power made Niyazow the leader of Turkmenistan and shaped the country's path after it got its freedom under a regime that kept many of the authoritarian rules and economic policies from the Soviet era. Niyazow explained his dictatorial actions by saying that in order to avoid chaos, economic security must come before political diversity. He said that if he was in charge for 10 years, Turkmenistan would avoid that and go into an economic golden age. Niyazow wanted to make himself and the political elite rich while making Turkmenistan's 4 million people happy by giving them free gas, electricity, water, and highly subsidized food. He kept up a large security and media network to make sure he could stay in power. But Turkmenistan's economy was going downhill fast. The country's economy shrank over 6 years to less than half of what it was in 1991. The main problem was that its political freedom and economic independence didn't match. Gas and cotton from Turkmenistan could only be shipped, sold, and handled through Russia. Russia took advantage of Turkmenistan's dependence by buying these goods at much lower prices than the international market. To get to markets around the world, Turkmenistan had to build its own natural gas pipelines and trains to get around Russia's monopoly. In the late 1990s, the country built a pipeline to the northeast of Iran and set up train links with it. The Trans-Caspian pipeline to bring gas to Western Europe was a bolder plan, but it ran into a number of problems. Even with these problems, the talks led to a better gas deal with Russia and by 2000, a reduction in Turkmenistan's trade imbalance. Along with this, work was done to build new textile plants, turn farmland into food production land, and fix up an old Soviet oil refinery. All of these projects led to a huge economic boom that made Turkmenistan's economy one of the fastest growing in the world. Following Niyazow's death, power shifted to Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow. While he initially reversed some of Niyazow's more extreme policies, he continued the tradition of authoritarian rule. He recognized the need to diversify gas export markets and focused on China as a major buyer. New pipelines were built, and exports to China skyrocketed. This economic shift initially brought high growth, But Gurbanguly, like his predecessor, couldn't resist vanity projects. Marble-clad buildings and extravagant personal palaces became a new norm. Unfortunately, the economic boom proved unsustainable. The shale revolution in the United States and strategic decisions by OPEC led to a dramatic drop in gas prices. Turkmenistan's economy, heavily reliant on gas exports, took a major hit. Exports and GDP halved, plunging the nation into a financial crisis. The government budget went from a surplus to a deficit, leading to shortages of essential goods like food and medicine. Rationing became the order of the day, and the population faced a harsh reality. Despite the economic woes, Berdimuhamedov's regime maintained a tight grip on power. Political freedoms remained limited, corruption flourished, and access to information from outside the country was severely restricted. The wealth generated from gas exports wasn't used to improve the lives of ordinary citizens. Instead, it went to fund a repressive apparatus that effectively silenced any dissent. In a surprising turn of events, Berdimuhamedov stepped down in 2022, paving the way for his son, Serdar, to become president. However, hopes for a new era of reform were short-lived. The elder Berdimuhamedov retained significant power, essentially sidelining his son. As gas prices rose again due to geopolitical tensions, Turkmenistan's economic prospects seemed to improve. However, the political landscape remained unchanged, with the Berdimuhamedov family firmly in control. Looking ahead, Turkmenistan's future appears bleak. The country's dependence on a single resource and its authoritarian leadership make significant reforms unlikely. The lack of pressure, either from within the regime or from the international community, allows the government to maintain its grip on power. With vast gas reserves and a population under tight control, Turkmenistan may well stay one of the world's last remaining totalitarian states. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel for more updates.